What's up, Texas history? This is Mr. Whibby, and we're getting ready to jump into a video on the first Texans. Let's go ahead and look at it. So let's go ahead and let me move that over here. Let's go ahead and take a look at prehistory. So prehistory, what is prehistory? Well, prehistory is the part of history that we discuss or study before there is actually written documents of history. So in order to study history, because history has gone back so far, sometimes we have to develop theories. And a theory is like a scientific guess. It's a scientific guess based on what happened during prehistoric times. And when you look at it, we get information from anthropologists and archaeologists to determine what happened in prehistory. All right, so our anthropologists, what are anthropologists? So anthropology is a science, and that science is the study of what makes us humans. So anthropology is the study of what makes us human beings. So anthropologists study the culture, the language, just the actions of human being, of people, how we interact with one another. They are just scientists that gives us that information. And anthropologists take a broad approach to understand the many different aspects of the human experience. These scientists consider the past through archaeology to see how human groups lived hundreds of thousands of years ago and what's important to them. So we make a determination on prehistory based on the finds that we get from one group, which is anthropologists. The next group that we look at, the next scientist that gives us a lot of information and how we determine what happened in prehistory, which is the history before we have written documentation, is archaeology. And archaeology, the scientists who study archaeology or who actually do archaeology is called an archaeologist. And an archaeologist is a scientist or a scholar who studies human history and prehistory through the excavation of sites and analysis of artifacts and other physical remains. So these are people who actually go and dig up and do digs to find artifacts or any type of human remains. And when the archaeologists are super important to this process because they are the ones who give us the actual science behind prehistory. So we, as historians, we look at those artifacts and then we develop theories, or which are pretty much scientific guess, a scientific guess of how people from a long time ago lived based on the artifacts that the archaeologists have found. And once again, because we're talking about artifacts are objects left behind a long time ago. And those objects are preserved in the ground. And so oftentimes archaeologists have to dig for those artifacts. Once we find those artifacts, that's how we develop theories or scientific guess of how people lived hundreds and thousands of years ago before there were written documents. All right, so historians break things down into eras, and an era is a long period of time in history that have like a common theme. So oftentimes certain things kind of happen and coincide during a certain amount of time. And so when we as historians, break that down, we kind of divide things up into eras. There are a lot of eras in Texas history that we're going to be looking at. So we're going to be looking at natural Texas and its people, one of the earliest eras. So that's everything that happens before 1528. That's looking at indigenous or Native Americans. Indigenous people are also, we call them Native Americans before the Europeans arrived in Texas. And so we study those Native Americans. We study the complex societies that they built. All right, the next era that we look at is called the Age of Contact. That's from 1528 to 1690. And that's when Spanish explorers arrived in Texas in 1528 and how they interacted with the indigenous people or the Native Americans in Texas. All right, so the next period that we'll look at is the Spanish colonial period. So from 1690 to 1821 is when it existed. That's when the Spanish are going to start conquering the indigenous people and developing colonies. And that's that period. So the next era we have is Mexican National Period, which is from 1821 to 1836. This era began when Mexico won its independence from Spain. The Mexican government worked during this time to encourage settlement of Texas and to maintain control of all of the areas that was Texas then. The next era, that we're going to look at is the Revolution and the Republic. So that's from 1835 to 1845. This era is when Texas rebelled against the Mexican government and won their independence. You have the development of a new Texas Republic. After that, we're going to look at early statehood from 1845 to 1861. This is when Texas began to be an independent state, and then it worked its way into joining the United States in 1845. So we look at the challenges, including war, boundary disputes, and population increases. All right, the next era is Texas in the Civil War and Reconstruction. So this is from 1861 to 1874. So during that time, you have the Civil War. Texas withdrew from the United States, and fought on the side of the Confederate. During the Reconstruction period is when Texas got back into the United States, joined the Union, and it just we're going to look over the state's economy, society, and government. The next era is cotton, cattle, and railroads. This is from 1865 to 1900. During this era, the Texas economy recovered from the Civil War. Cotton farming and cotton ranching were major industries. The expansion of railroads helped both industries to grow. After that, we'll look at the age of oil from 1894 to 1935. You know, Texas is known for oil, which we call black gold. So we'll just discuss how Texas became a major player in the United States because of oil. So the next area is Texas in the Great Depression and World War II. That's from 1929 to 1945. We'll just look at Texas and how Texas existed during the Depression and Texas going into World War II. After that, from 1945 to 1980, you have one of my favorite periods, which is the Civil Rights Movement and Conservatism. So civil rights and conservatism. So this is from 1945 to 1980. So after World War II, African Americans, Latinos, Latinas, other groups were calling for changes to receive more civil rights. After that, you had whites and conservatives in the state of Texas begin to react to the call for civil rights. The next period we have is contemporary Texas. So this is since 1980. That's the period since 1980 has significant economic and political growth in Texas. New issues and conflicts challenge Texas as we move forward towards the future. Now, it's kind of ended in contemporary Texas, but I want you guys to think about this. We are currently in a pandemic. We also, when you think about September 11, 2001, during current times, there have been significant events that have happened in history. So going forward, the state as well as historians are going to write new books. What do you guys think they're going to name some of the new eras? I want you guys to think about that. Like right now, we're in a pandemic. We're in the COVID time. So what are going to be some of the new eras that Texas history books will have in the future? I want you guys to think about that. And so now, jumping into our current assignments and what we're going to be doing, we're going to be looking at Paleo-Indians, or the indigenous people of the Americas. The word paleo means old or ancient. So Paleo-Indian is another name for the first Americans. Today, a more politically correct term is indigenous peoples or Native Americans. Now, so traditional theories, and remember, a theory is a scientific guess. We believe that the first Americans, the indigenous people, were actually people that came from the area of Asia through China and some other places. They came through the Bering Strait from North Asia into the Americas over a land bridge called the Bering Strait. This bridge existed from 45,000 to 12,000 BCE. Small isolated groups of hunter-gatherers migrated alongside herds of large herbivores from Alaska. And remember, this is a theory. So from 1650 to about 1350 BCE, ice-free corridors developed along the Pacific coast and valleys of North America. So the indigenous people followed those animals because they needed them to hunt. They migrated into the interior of the continents, and people went as far south as to South America. So you guys will have an assignment over this information. Use this video to complete that assignment. Okay, you guys have a great day. Thank you. That's Mr. Whitby.